The first time I met Eric Dunst, he was standing on the ruins of my fence. It was barely past 7 on a crisp May morning when the low snarl of machinery shattered the peace of Lake Madrone. I was brewing coffee in the cabin's cramped kitchen when the vibration started, windows rattling in their frames, birds scattering from the birches. By the time I stepped outside, boots crunching on pine needles, the damage was already done. The fence, hand-cut cedar logs, bound with iron wire, stained deep against the lake wind, lay splintered across the earth like a corpse after a fight. Dust floated in shafts of morning light, and at the heart of it, perched on the splintered posts, like a smug vulture, stood a man in a white polo and boat shoes, Eric. He was flanked by a hulking yellow bulldozer, idling like it had a heartbeat, and a pair of clipboard-wielding assistants, wearing matching smiles that didn't reach their eyes. "Good morning, Mr. Rayner," Eric called, offering a casual salute with his stainless steel coffee mug. "We finally cleared the violation." I blinked, still trying to process what I was seeing. Violation. Yes, your perimeter fence. It's non-compliant with the Lakeview Estates Shoreline Code. Article 4, Section 3C. Natural aesthetics only. No tall barriers or obstructive installations within 30 feet of the waterline. I glanced at the lake behind him, still as glass, the early light catching flecks of pollen across its surface. My dock stretched out into it like a weathered tongue. No footprints, no tire marks, just the water. Still mine, for now. "I don't belong to Lakeview Estates," I said. "This cabin predates the development. You've got no jurisdiction here." Eric smiled like he'd been waiting for that. "Actually, the HOA board passed a retroactive annexation last quarter. Your parcel was included, due to its proximity and shared lake access. We sent out a notice." I folded my arms. "I never received anything." "It was emailed," he replied, producing a printout like a magician pulling a rabbit from a file folder. "Check your spam." The confidence in his voice wasn't just arrogance. It was the certainty of someone who'd done this before. Eric wasn't just an HOA president. He was a scalpel. Every word, every action, precise and practiced. The type who turned bureaucracy into blood sport. "I built that fence with my own hands," I said, voice low, deliberate. "It's on my land. You had no right." He didn't flinch. "We followed procedure. You can file an appeal if you like, but I should warn you, appeals are reviewed by the same board that authorized the demolition. Best to accept the change and move forward. After all, we're neighbors now." I looked past him at the flattened logs, the snapped beams. Each one was a piece of labor, of memory, not just wood, but a line between solitude and invasion. "How many properties did you annex?" I asked. "Yours was the last. The rest went through last fall. And you expect me to just roll over like they did?" Eric sipped from his mug, then shrugged. "Compliance is easier when you don't resist. This community thrives on uniformity, Mr. Rayner. Your cabin's quaint, but it doesn't match the tone we're establishing here. We can help you modernize." I took a step forward, boots grinding on gravel. I didn't ask for help. "I know," he said, turning back toward the bulldozer. That's the problem. Within minutes, they were gone. Dust settling, silence returning like it was ashamed of being interrupted. I stood alone on the wreckage of my boundary, something raw and electric building behind my ribs. Eric saw my property as an eyesore, an obstacle to erase, but what he didn't see, what none of them saw, was that I wasn't like the other lake folk. I hadn't bought peace and quiet. I'd earned it, I'd bled for it. And I wasn't about to give it up because a man in boat shoes decided it didn't. Match the tone. I turned back toward the cabin, but my eyes drifted to the dock, still untouched, still solid, still hiding what lay beneath. They'd crossed the line. They just didn't know how far I'd go to redraw it. 2 days after the fence incident, I caught Eric Dunst standing on my dock. He hadn't seen me yet. I watched from the shadows of the tree line. Backlit by the dusky orange bleeding across the lake, he walked slowly, arms crossed behind his back, like some self-appointed admiral inspecting his fleet. Every step he took down that weathered wood felt like a trespass. My dock wasn't just for fishing or mooring a canoe. It was something more deliberate, an old military habit, repurposed. I'd laced its underside with a redundant system of pressure sensors, tripwires, and motion detectors, all rigged to a non-lethal but memorable surprise. The C4 was inert for now, a precaution, but everything else, active. Eric had no idea how close he danced to the edge. I stepped forward just as he reached the bench at the end, whistling a tuneless rhythm. My boots on the gravel path broke the silence like a shot. "You lost, President Dunst." He turned, unshaken. "Just admiring the view, Mr. Rayner. This dock extends further than HOA code allows. I'd estimate at least 10 feet beyond regulation. You're standing on private property," I said. Uninvited. His eyes glinted. "As HOA president, I have the authority to inspect community shoreline structures for safety and conformity. It's all part of our lakeshore beautification plan." I could feel my jaw tighten. "You're really leaning into this emperor routine," laughed lightly. "It's not personal, I assure you. Think of it as stewardship. Without guidelines, things descend into chaos, and your lot's unique character disrupts cohesion." "Cohesion," I repeated. "You mean conformity." "Semantics." He stepped off the dock with deliberate slowness, brushing past me with the confidence of someone used to not being stopped. "I'll be filing a notice of dock violation. Expect it by week's end. Oh, and you'll want to attend our HOA Generals Assembly next Saturday. Attendance is mandatory now. You've been annexed after all." He left without looking back. The moment he disappeared around the tree line, I pulled my phone and disabled the dock sensors, just in case. Eric was bold, but not stupid. Eventually, he'd start snooping underneath. Back inside, I opened the rusted locker behind the fireplace. My tools were still there, nestled in a false wall. Not weapons, not anymore, but gear, signal, blockers, acoustic sensors, remote trigger relays. Not the kind of toys you'd pick up at Radio Shack. And not meant for suburban squabbles. But this wasn't suburban anymore. This was an invasion. I scrolled through the HOA annexation documents. Eric had emailed. Buried deep in the fine print was a clause about non-conforming legacy properties. That's me. They couldn't forcibly remove me, but they could fine me, daily. They could impose restrictions, shut off lake access, block permits. It was death by paper cut. Eric didn't need to take the cabin. He just had to make me miserable enough to leave. I wouldn't give him the satisfaction. That Saturday, I arrived at the HOA assembly dressed in my old Army issue jacket, boots dusted, hat low. The meeting was held in the glassy new clubhouse overlooking the lake. A shrine to bland opulence with granite counters and reclaimed wood accents, as if luxury needed camouflage. Dozens of property owners filled the room, sipping flavored water and nodding at PowerPoint slides. Eric stood at the front like a preacher in a tech vest, pacing as he clicked through bar graphs. And with full annexation complete, we can now proceed with Phase 3. Removal of non-standard structures, fencing, and unauthorized lake modifications. This will raise property values by an estimated 18% over the next quarter. He saw me and smiled, a slow, shark-like grin. I waited until the Q&A. "Mr. Rayner," he said, fake warmth coating his tone. "Glad to see you embracing your new community." I stood, cleared my throat. Question: under what authority did this board annex private land that was never part of Lakeview Estate's original charter? Polite coughs. Tension. A few heads turned. Eric replied smoothly. The authority was granted by a unanimous vote. Owners around the lake agreed to expand the HOA's protective jurisdiction. I didn't vote. You are not yet a member. And yet I'm bound to rules I didn't approve. Sounds unconstitutional. A woman near the back muttered. He's got a point. Eric's smile tightened. You're welcome to file a formal challenge, Mr. Rayner. Oh, I will, I said. And when I do, I hope your insurance covers what happens when a man's pushed off his land. The room went still. Eric stared at me for a long second. Then, with practiced ease, he moved on to the next question. But I'd seen it, the flicker, behind his eyes. The first sign of a crack in the armor. They wanted to turn my home into a model lot. But I didn't survive 2 tours just to be steamrolled by a HOA. They declared war. Now it was my turn to respond. By Monday morning, the violation notices began arriving like clockwork. 7 to be exact. Each printed on cream cardstock and tucked into identical envelopes bearing the Lakeview Estate's crest. One was for my dock, another for the non-regulation exterior stain of my cabin. There were even citations for the unapproved woodpile structure, my satellite dish, and, somehow, my dog's bark volume during quiet hours. It was a full-court press. Eric's weapon wasn't force. It was attrition, paper, protocol, pressure. Designed to wear down resolve. Designed for ordinary people with ordinary limits. But I wasn't ordinary. Not anymore. I'd been trained to wait, to watch. In Kandahar, I'd once sat in a collapsed minaret for 18 hours without moving more than a finger. Patience was easy when you knew what was coming. That evening, I walked the perimeter of my property, boots crunching on pine needles. I wasn't just stretching my legs. I was checking traps, surveillance cameras hidden in birdhouses, fiber optic lines running just beneath the moss, even a decoy trail cam pointed toward the road to bait interference. Everything was clean. For now, back inside, I opened the steel case beneath my bed. Inside was a sleek black remote with a worn red switch cap. I flipped it open. The C4 beneath the dock wasn't active yet, but I had wired the charges with purpose. Not to harm anyone. That wasn't the point. No, this was a message, locked and loaded. And when the time came, the message would speak louder than any notice or board meeting ever could. I didn't need to destroy anything, just show I could. Later that week, I got a visit, not from Eric, but from one of his lieutenants, a thin, balding man named Curtis Rell, with watery eyes and khakis that wrinkled when he breathed. He showed up with a clipboard and an apologetic expression. "Mr. Rayner," he said, shifting from foot to foot, "we just want to work with you. You're trespassing." Right. Sorry." He stepped back behind the invisible boundary that used to be marked by my fence. Eric's worried. You've been, uncooperative. He bulldozed my property. I know. Look, maybe it got out of hand. But now you've got people on the board spooked. There's talk of legal action, injunctions, even restraining orders. For what? Curtis hesitated. Your military background. Some of the board members think you're unstable. I stared at him long enough that he dropped his eyes. Then I leaned forward, resting my hands on the porch railing. Tell Eric, I said. He should be very careful. What kind of man he tries to provoke. Curtis nodded quickly and backed off, practically jogging to his SUV. By Friday, the HOA filed a motion to enter my property for a compliance assessment. They even brought a sheriff's deputy to serve it, though the man looked more embarrassed than stern. I knew what that meant. They were coming back. I spent that night by the fire pit, staring out at the dock. The lake was black and motionless, stars trembling on the surface. Beneath the boards, the C4 sat nestled in waterproof cases, rigged to flash charges, non-lethal but dramatic. When detonated, they'd send water and light 30 feet into the air. Enough to make a point. The idea wasn't madness. It was restraint, surgical chaos. I waited for the weekend. Saturday arrived quiet and cold. I left the cabin just after dawn, coffee in hand, and took up my seat in a camouflaged hunting blind, tucked into the ridge just above the shoreline. I didn't have to wait long. At 9:13 a.m., 3 HOA board members arrived in matching polos. Eric was with them, along with a private contractor carrying what looked like a drone camera rig. They were here to document the non-compliance. Their words, not mine. Eric stood at the head of the dock, gesturing grandly. As you can see, it extends beyond the 30-foot limit. The board recommends full removal. The contractor stepped forward, and then, just as his boot hit the center panel of the dock, I flicked the remote, a heartbeat of silence. Then, boom, a controlled explosion sent a tower of water sky high. A shockwave rippled across the surface. Light, sound, spray. A perfect vertical geyser that drenched all 4 men instantly. Screams, chaos. Cameras dropped. The contractor ran. Eric stood frozen, soaked and shaking. I stepped out of the tree line. You trespassed. Again, Eric gawked. You could have killed us. I raised the remote. This was a warning. You want to see what happens if I stop showing restraint? He stared at me, stunned. You call me unstable, I said, but I've lived by rules tighter than any HOA handbook. I give one warning. That was it. Eric didn't respond. He just turned and fled, soaked shoes squishing as he tripped over the gravel. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat, but in that moment, the lake was mine again. They didn't come back the next day, or the next week. For the first time since the fence came down, the lake was silent again. Not with the oppressive stillness of surveillance or threat, but peace. Genuine, undisturbed quiet. It didn't last. By the end of the month, I received a certified letter. Lakeview Estates, HOA, Sus Caleb Rayner. The claim? Intentional property damage, intimidation, and reckless endangerment. The amount? $180,000 in punitive damages. They weren't just trying to win now. They wanted to erase me. But I wasn't the same man they'd met on that first afternoon, quietly rebuilding a life on the lakeside. I'd remembered who I was. And now, I was ready. I pulled out the flash drive I'd stashed behind my bookshelf, popped it into the old laptop, and queued up the footage. Multiple camera angles, crystal clear, date-stamped, geotagged. The trespass, the violations, the exact moment Eric and his crew crossed the line, literally and legally. More than that, I had audio. Curtis's visit, the veiled threats, the admission that Eric's bulldozing had been a mistake, all recorded, all admissible. I sent the first package to a lawyer in town, Vivian Tran, former JAG attorney with a reputation for surgical litigation. Her first reaction when she saw the evidence, "Oh, we're going to have fun with this." The second package I sent to a local reporter, Benny Marks, who ran a weekend column on small-town corruption and overreach. She called me 2 hours later. "You're the guy with the Doc C4 footage." I didn't correct her. Let the myth build. By Tuesday, the headline hit the paper. Veteran battles HOA over property rights after illegal demolition. My phone buzzed all day with media requests. Vivian advised silence. Let them hang themselves in the court of public opinion first. Then we bury them in court. The tide was turning. At the next HOA meeting, Eric didn't show. Neither did half the board. The rest sat nervously as residents. Some furious, some curious, crowded the room. They asked questions. Why had thousands been spent on legal fees without a vote? Why was the HOA demolishing fences without permits? Why were citations being issued unevenly, selectively? Curtis tried to speak, tried to explain, but it was too late. The story had broken containment. When the case hit court, it barely lasted 3 sessions. Vivian dismantled their claims with precision. The judge ruled the HOA had acted outside its charter, violated property rights, and inflicted emotional distress. Not only was I exonerated, but the board was ordered to pay restitution, $30,000. Public apology. Full reinstatement of my property boundaries. But I didn't stop there. I requested an audit of the HOA's finances. Vivian filed the motion. The results were damning. Unapproved contracts, nepotism, missing funds. Eric had been siphoning money through a shell landscaping company for 2 years. He resigned in disgrace. Curtis too. The board collapsed. A new election was called. I didn't run. I didn't want power. But I made one thing very clear in the community meeting that followed. I stood in front of the same people who once watched my fence fall and said, I came here for peace. You all did too once. But somewhere along the way, we let fear dictate policy. We let petty tyrants speak for us. No more. There was silence. Not the awkward kind. The kind that meant something landed. A woman in the front row, someone I'd never spoken to, stood and said, thank you. Others nodded. A few clapped. And just like that, the war ended. Weeks passed. The lake thawed into summer. I rebuilt the dock. No wires this time. Just cedar planks and quiet strength. I planted flowers where the old fence once stood and watched birds return to the pine. One afternoon, as the sun dipped below the hills, a group of kids biked past and waved. I waved back. Later, I found a letter tucked under my door, handwritten. Dear Mr. Rayner, I'm sorry for how things started. You were right to fight back. We're glad you stayed. The neighbors. I folded the letter and slid it into the journal I kept tucked in my duffel. Not everything needed to be burned or blown up. Some things could just be kept. I sat on the edge of the dock that night, feet dangling over still water, sipping from an old thermos. There were no fences around me, no cameras, just wind and the occasional call of a loon across the lake. I smiled finally. Sometimes to reclaim peace, you have to remind the world that you still remember how to make war, but you choose not to. And that choice, made loud enough, is what keeps the wolves at bay.